All right, well, good to see you everyone. Hope you've enjoyed the conference so far. I enjoyed having a lunch yesterday with Maxime, which was so big, I couldn't stay awake in the afternoon. I had a talk right at the end of the day, so today I decided to make sure I didn't have breakfast with Maxime. Came to this talk fresh, so it's going to be a bit easier than yesterday. I'll be talking about domain-driven design and team topologies. If you've not heard of those things before, that's totally fine. It's all beginner content, really. And if, I know a lot of the talks here are more technical focused. If you come along to this talk to check it out and you feel like it's not your cup of tea and you want to leave, totally fine. So I'll tell you about my cup of tea, the kind of thing I do for work. Got an example here. This was my first experience of doing some in-person stuff after the pandemic. It was in September last year, 2021. Yep. Timelines are a bit fuzzy these days, forgetting which things happen in which year. Some holiday photos at the top right-hand corner. So basically, this company, they were getting together for the first time after the pandemic. A lot of people seeing each other in person, and they invited me to join them for the day to do some event storming. It was on a farm. Well, they told me it was in Berlin. I looked at the postcode, I'm like, that's the kind of thing London would do when they name an airport. That's not a London airport, that's like 100 miles away from London. This was like 50 miles north of Berlin on a farm, basically. So it's pretty cool, and this room here was the yoga room on an old farm. Actually, as soon as you walked in that room, you could smell, it was a nice smell. It was a nice organic wood smell, like the old wood. I actually really like the smells of wood, so it was great for me. And so basically, we had a whole bunch of people from the company there involved in this workshop. We had like product, head of product. We had a bunch of developers and testers. I think there were UX people there too. We had customer success people who were actually going out, helping their customers, their users to use the product. I don't want to give too much right about the company. We had one from accounting there. And we also had the CEO there. Now, this company was really interesting because the CEO, he's worked in some big companies, and he's trying to build this startup inside a larger company. And his approach is, he really wants the teams to be more empowered to own the products themselves. He doesn't want to become, he kept calling it a big company. So, the idea was get people together, and we'll do some event storming. We'll put together their business and how it works. We'll get all of these different people, and we'll see what happens. Actually, it was pretty amazing. It reminded me after a lot of months at home during the pandemic, how good it can be to get a whole group of people together in person and to do some event storming. And there were a bunch of takeaways from this day. I would say the thing that stood out to me was the conversations between the different people, especially the customer success people, who actually went out to like warehouses and physical places to meet their users. And they were bringing that insights back into the workshop as we mapped out this process. And the developers were like, oh, I didn't realize that. Oh, I didn't realize the system worked that way. So a lot of cross-pollination was going on. And one of the big things we realized is right at the start of the timeline, so with event storming, we map out the business as a timeline. Right at the start of the timeline, they were receiving some data, and they had to process that data and clean it up and make it usable later in the process. But that cleaning up process wasn't 100% successful. And the team working on that were responsible for that area of cleaning up the data. That data flowed all the way through the business, affected all of the other teams, and it's something that happened at the start has an impact all the way through the business on all the other teams. Because the data wasn't, I wish I could say more about this, but I don't want to give too many details, right? But because the data wasn't fully cleaned up as it went through the process, it was having an impact on the users. It was giving them bad information. And so these users didn't want to use the application. And so downstream, the company had to build all of these incentives and reports to try and encourage the users, please use the application, because when the user doesn't use the application, so someone who's receiving a parcel, I can give a bit away, they won't mind. So someone who receives a parcel will get like a time slot. Your parcel's coming between 11 a.m. and midday. So if you stay at home between those time periods, you'll get your parcel, and then you can enjoy your day. So, if you're at home and the parcel doesn't come, you're like, I've been waiting here for this parcel, it hasn't come, and as soon as you leave the house, it turns up. So that has an even bigger impact on the other parts of the business, because the end recipients of parcels get angry. So just this act of cleansing the data at the start had this impact all the way through the process, and it affected every single team. And just getting together and mapping all of that out with all of the people in this nice room that smells of wood, very old wood, with a Buddha in the corner watching us. Well, not in the corner, in the fireplace. Yeah, it was nice. It was just good to see. A lot of insights were happening. And then in the evening, they allowed me to stay and join them for a nice dinner and a wine tasting. That was pretty cool. And at one of the tables, so in the event storming session, one of the teams said, yeah, we've got this problem, we need to build an API. And one of the other teams said, oh, we've already built an API that does that. They didn't even realize. Two teams in the same company, it's not even a big company, didn't even realize that an API already existed for their problem. So at the dinner and the wine tasting, they'd actually implemented that on the same day. Event storming in the day, fix a problem in the evening, getting together for collaboration. So this, to me, that day on that farm with the lovely smelling wood, that to me is a sign of what it's like to be working in a modern company these days, the way we build products, the way software developers and product people and all these roles work together. And there's two things here. This is coming from the product management space now. So there's the surveys. It used to be called Alpha UX. I think they changed the name now. But this is what product managers think. They think that the best ideas come from the team brainstorming. Well, that's the second best idea. It's very close to being the best idea. And that's what happens with event storming. You get your team together. Like, if you've read the domain-driven design book, it all feels very one way. It's like the developers talk to the domain experts and build a model. But nowadays, it's like the whole team gets together, and the whole team is designing the product together themselves. The boundaries between people who design the product and people who implement it, that's becoming very blurry. Marty Kagan's got a nice quote too. If you're only using your engineers to code, you're getting like half their value. And if you've been to an event storming session and you've seen developers and testers and customer support people all working together to figure out how can we improve the product, I think you would definitely agree with that statement. I also think this diagram John Cutler's put together emphasizes this kind of transition that we're going through. If you think about the top row waterfall back in the 90s, every team, every step in the process of building software was a separate team with a handover. You had the development team who received requirements, hand over to the testing team who tested. Obviously, there's a lot of stuff going back here when things fail testing, so it wasn't always just one way. But then over the last 10, 20 years, we had this Agile thing. When Agile first started, it was like, oh, we'll have the developers and testers sitting together to make it a bit quicker. Then it became a bit more, oh, let's get the developers to own the testing themselves and work closely with the testers in the same team. Owning their releases, you build it, you run it. And then probably in the 2010s, I think, started to move the other way too. We started to bring design into the teams. And now we're in this phase down here towards the bottom where we're starting to expect teams to build the products themselves. Requirements don't come into the teams. It's more about, hey, here's your North Star as a team. Figure out yourselves what you want to build, work with the business to define your OKRs. And so I use this diagram a lot when I'm running workshops to understand where companies think they are and where they want to get to. Now, we still have a lot of people quite close to the top. It's not like we're all down here in this happy world of event storming now. So a lot of companies in this model up here, but you can see that most people do want to get to this part at the bottom where the whole team is responsible for the product. So I think that's where we're moving, and that's why concepts like event storming are really useful for bringing the whole team together. But on the flip side of this, sometimes managers think it's an easy thing to go from up here to down here, when really it's incredibly difficult to go from having silos and handovers to the team owns everything. On one side here, you can't just change your teams to be all empowered and autonomous because your software architecture is is already aligned in a certain way. When I worked at Salesforce in 2016, I realized this. I was quite naive at the time. Like, I was responsible for the architecture, and I was like, well, however we shape our architecture, however we organize our domains, the way the teams are currently structured means every team will touch every code base. You can't really change software architecture without changing the way teams are structured. So that's part of this, and then it's not just about structure. There's a lot of leadership changes that need to go through management of the company, going from up here to down here. And it's such a huge mindset change. And here's a couple of examples. So I'm not going to say much about this company, but it's kind of a theme I see a lot. It's like, people like to focus on structure. We've identified that our teams might be organized in the wrong way. Help us to find our value streams, what they should be, and we'll organize the teams around those, and everything's going to be great, right? Like, yeah, why is it taking so long? They expect this in like a couple of days workshop. It's not that simple. This was another example from 2017, a German company. We had this 2-day workshop to identify all of their domains. And we had a good event storming session, actually. I was pretty proud of it. And then at the end, they were like, okay, let's talk about the teams now. And they said, no, not a 50-year-old, it's 10-year-old. We've got a 10-year-old monolith, C++, with 50,000 business rules. Everything's tightly coupled. And then they had this other slide where it was like, we're going to have all of these independent teams with their completely separate backlogs, all working independently. It's like, never going to happen, is it? When you've got a code base that coupled, you can't just suddenly have all these autonomous, empowered teams doing that stuff on their own. So this is where domain-driven design and team topologies start coming together to try and give us a picture of what we can try and get to and how we can get there too. So thinking back to John Cutler's diagram from a few slides ago, those different levels, that bottom level he's looking at, we need to have a structure like this, both the teams and the architecture. So in team topologies, we have stream-aligned teams. A team owns a value stream, and a value stream is an area of the business or a domain that the team is responsible for. The team works in that area to identify new opportunities for the business. And then that team is responsible for building the capabilities that they need to address the problems they've found themselves in that domain. They own the software to do that, and they're responsible for delivering it to customers, assessing it, monitoring it in the market and stuff. So that's really the structure of a value stream in that bottom row. We've got the team aspect, the domain aspect, and the software aspect. And so in this talk today, I'm going to show you how you can use these different techniques, event storming, team topologies, and domain-driven design to go through this process of identifying your domain boundaries, your value streams, and then looking at team topologies concepts to work out, are they good boundaries? Looking at some of the team aspects we talked about around ownership, coupling, and autonomy. And then we'll look at some concepts from domain-driven design called core domains, which is about helping you focus on where should we start first. Because I don't want to give you this idea that it's kind of like you have an event storming workshop, you find all your domains, and then you go home on Friday and you come back on Monday and you do a big reorg. It's much more gradual than that. So I'm going to try and get across of that in this part here. Just going to have a quick drink. So if you haven't heard of event storming before, kind of emphasizing here what I was alluding to earlier, it's great because you bring people together from different parts of the business and different skills, and you can start to see everything together. Like I talked about in the workshop in Germany, we had those 2 developers in different teams who realized, oh, you've built an API for that we could use. We didn't realize that. And we also had the customer success people and the product people bringing their insights, contrasting with what the developers thought of things. So it's like vertical, horizontal, a lot of sharing knowledge. And if you want to find good domain boundaries, I think this is key, really, to get all those insights together in one place. Otherwise, traditionally, this has often been done by architects working to the side, but this is based on all of their assumptions, whereas with event storming, it's much more democratized, bringing more people's insights into the process so we can make more sensible decisions. If you haven't seen event storming, it's kind of simple, really. If you're expecting something big and exciting and amazing, it's just orange Post-its in a timeline. That's it. How can I speak for like 50 minutes about orange Post-its in a timeline? I'll just give you a quick example, though. So these events are in past tense. Order dropped off, 10 reward points added to driver's profile, delivery received, food eaten, 5-star review left. And we can see there's 2 different flows there. The simplicity is really what makes it accessible to a wide group. It's a low fidelity technique, which means there's no learning curve, and you can get a bunch of people together who've never done it before, like we did in Germany, and you can actually map out the whole business together. So that's why it's cool. Once you've mapped out an event storm, it then becomes a map or a landscape, and you can start doing lots of interesting things with it. Firstly, in this example, you can start identifying problems and hotspots. The great thing about this is, someone might indicate there's a problem, and someone else might say, oh, I never knew about that. Kind of like the API situation. Oh, I never knew you had that problem. We've got an API for you. Here it is. We'll fix it in the wine tasting later. What else we got on here? Yeah, so you can map out all kinds of problems on an event storm. Technical errors, where the company's losing money. What else have we got? Yeah, where people disagree about things. Often we have people who think parts of a business process work in different ways. Someone says, no, the process works this way. Someone else says, no, it works that way. With event storming, we can highlight those inconsistencies, and we can validate that after the workshop. On the other side of things, we can also identify opportunities, things like target new customers. That's why it's always good to be specific in your event storming sessions. If you just talk about a customer, you're losing some insights there. If you talk about like a gold customer or a silver customer, you can then start saying, oh, how could we change his process? How would it be different? What would we need to do differently in our product to support someone who's not a silver customer? What about if we wanted to have like a bronze customer? So being specific starts to open up all of these opportunities. And to be honest, the thing about event storming is when you've got all these orange Post-its and on a timeline just laid out, it's like so hard to not think of problems and opportunities there. You just start to see things. Oh, what if we did that differently? What if we did those 2 things in a different order? It's just, my mind goes crazy when I see an event storm, like all these things just jumping out at me. And I think it's probably the same for everyone. It's just such a great technique. So once you've mapped out your business with event storming, that's when we get into start identifying boundaries. These boundaries will become our team boundaries and software boundaries. So we have this concept called a pivotal event. It's a simple concept, but I sometimes struggle to explain it. So I'll try and start with this simple definition first. I would say the simple way of looking for a pivotal event is where one sub-process ends or another one starts. It's not always clear where something starts and stops, but generally, if you look for that, you'll end up in the right places. So we've got this example here, and I've highlighted membership requested as a pivotal event. And this is because it feels like this part here is the member or the candidate, the non-member requesting. That feels to me separate, like they've requested this membership. For them, that part of the process is done, and now we're triggering 2 separate processes, the anti-fraud checks and the onboarding assessment. So you could say that's all one process, but to me that looks like a a seam between different sub-processes. And there's a couple of other clues on here. I would probably pick out the handover as a good one. Whenever you see, so these events here are the non-member, but now we've got a fraud checker and an account manager involved. So that handover between different roles is also another sign you're at the edge of a process. We can also see, well, it's not actually on here, but over here we call the person a non-member. But after this membership requested pivotal event, we now refer to them as a pending member. So that actor's role, how we refer to them, has changed. So yeah, all these signs are pointing towards, that's a boundary between different things. Another thing I always recommend looking for is these domain roles. If anyone came to the workshop yesterday morning, we already talked about this. But basically, different parts of your business serve different generic roles, let's say. So campaign builder, this is from an advertising industry. Campaign builder is about describing the advertising campaign you want to run. It's all about collecting all the information, making the choices, creating the specification of what to do. Then the next domain, campaign runner, is taking that specification and running that campaign for you. So that often, that split between describe and do is a good candidate for boundaries. And then optimize at the end, this is characterized by taking lots of information from different places, harvesting that, and generating some insights from that, like, oh, in this example, you're never getting any impressions between 6 a.m. and 10 a.m. in the morning. Why don't you just not run your campaign during those hours and try different hours instead? That kind of stuff. So again, these are more clues about the boundaries. So once you've got an event storm, you can start applying all of these clues, looking for pivotal events. You can start shaping it into different domains. This is an example of a remote session. You know, it's very similar in person or remote. Try and slice it up. There are some great advantages to remote, though. You can copy and paste the event storm, have different groups, exploring different possibilities, really find that aspect of remote interesting. And here's an example of something which is sometimes event storming can lead you slightly in the wrong direction. Because it's a timeline, it biases you towards grouping things which are together in the timeline. But this is an important distinction between like a user journey and a domain. So in this example here, we've got the onboarding process. These are some steps a user goes through from not being a user to actually being in the system and able to use the company's products and services. So we call that phase the onboarding. But if you look at this user journey is actually using different capabilities. So adding personal information, uploading a driving license, adding some funds to your accounts, yeah, those capabilities are very different. We probably wouldn't want to have those in the same code base. You know, they're very separate, even though they're brought together as part of this process. So that's one thing to look out for with event storming. Try not to confuse too much the journeys and the domains. However, very often you will have a domain which is a sequence of events in the timeline. So yeah, it's just those subtleties to look for. All right, so what I'm going to talk about now is how you can go from event storming towards software architecture and your team boundaries. Now, I would definitely say event storming's, it's not going to get you all the way there. What comes out of an event storming session to me is what I would call a candidate value stream or candidate domain boundaries. You know, it's still quite high level. We need to get more into the details and validate those further. And that's where team topologies can help. If you've not heard of team topologies before, a very quick definition here. It's basically a bunch of principles and patterns for establishing teams in the model of John Cutler we spoke about earlier, those bottom rows in the process where we have autonomous teams who design the product, who build the product, who support it in production, you build it, you run it. It's about principles and ideas to achieve that. And this book has been really good at getting management and leaders to understand these concepts. And it's actually, if you're a developer and if you find sometimes management and leadership in your company doesn't really get some of the technical concepts, this book is doing a lot to change the management perspective in our industry. I've been on a lot of Zoom calls where people just have a copy of this book. It's almost become like a meme now. Like, have you read Topologies? Like, yeah, I have it. And I'm like, well, I've got a signed copy, so. So where are we going with that? Yeah, so I think it's also useful for developers to be able to understand these concepts too, be able to talk with your business, get these ideas into your company. I think one of the best ways to actually start applying team topologies is to look at the independent service heuristics they've created on GitHub, a list of questions and checks. It's nothing too complicated, but if you've identified some potential domain boundaries or architecture boundaries or team boundaries, you can go through this list and start assessing it, like, will this work? Are we ready to commit to these candidate boundaries? So the first one is around the concept of cognitive load. I would say in my experience, most teams are overloaded, right? Everyone's like urgent deadlines, lots of work, don't have time to go slowly, think properly, add quality. And so team topologies have been making this essential concept in the book, trying to help management and leaders understand you need to stop putting so much load into your teams. You're just overworking your teams, and that's causing you to have unmaintainable software. So in order to explain that, there's a couple of team topologies has basically been quite opinionated about what a team is to try and emphasize this. So they're saying that a good team is 5 to 9 people. In my experience, I would strongly agree with that. I think when I've been in a team with more than 9 people, you do start to get a lot of distractions. It's hard to keep up with all the people in your team. So I'm quite on board with this. I would have been happy with that anyway. And there's also some research which is about the more people in a team, the harder it is to build a high level of trust with that many people. So 5 to 9, there is some research behind that. And so that's basically the upper limit. You've got to identify basically the maximum size domain you can have in your event storm or after your event storming session is something that can be managed by a team of 5 to 9 people. If it's too much work, if there's too much work going on in that domain, then it's too big. And this first check here would stop us doing that. Sometimes I see incredible things, and this was incredible. I was working with one company, and there was a team of 3 developers. They were working on the company's oldest legacy. I'm like, wow, that's a pretty tough gig. You don't have many people. You've got to do all the new business work coming in, and you've got to try and refactor it and clean this old system up. That's crazy. And then we got to the best bit. I'm like, they kept talking about, we don't know who to please. We've got a lot of people asking us to do work. So I'm like, can you tell me who these people are? Can we just discuss all the sources of work? And they legitimately had 10 different stakeholders who all wanted them to build stuff in that year. If that is not cognitive overload, I do not know what is. That's just crazy. So that's what we're trying to avoid here. It is okay for a team to own multiple domains if they're smaller and less complex, or maybe one larger domain. So there is some trade-offs here. And in a lot of companies, you do have a lot of small systems. You don't have enough teams to have one team per domain. So there are some trade-offs to be made here, but you should never get to this situation. All right, so the second heuristic, there's 10 heuristics on that page. This is another one I picked out around the independent aspect. So we looked at John Cutler's diagram earlier, and this heuristic is saying, is the organization prepared so that this team can own an area of the domain, identify opportunities themselves, and implement these things themselves? So in team topologies, they talk about these different interaction modes as a way to identify if a team has too many dependencies of the wrong type. The first type is collaboration. This is basically a situation where 2 teams are working together, usually with some shared goals. Like, I'm building some stuff in my code base, Max is building some stuff in his code base, and collectively, those things will come together as part of some new feature. We have a collaboration. We have stand-ups together, we have meetings together, we do planning together, we go for lunch together, although not anymore. So that, collaboration is quite a high trust, adds cognitive load there to your team. Some of your time is taken up collaborating with other teams. X as a service, on the other hand, is where my team maybe uses Max's API, but I don't have to collaborate with him to do that. I read his docs, I send him a couple of messages on Slack, and I can start using it, kind of like when you use AWS and cloud stuff. And then facilitating is where one team is spending some time helping another team, like coaching, or if my team's late, we've got a big deadline coming up, maybe Max will help us to achieve that deadline. So the key thing is, when you start to map these out, you can start to identify problems. So in this example here, you can see that all of the collaboration, all of the interactions between the teams is collaboration. There's no X as a service in this company anywhere. And that's adding a high cognitive load. There was a lot of talk around the integration platform, that this team was always a bottleneck for things. And when we spoke to this team, it turned out that this integration platform team they were building stuff for those other teams. So they'd gone from being a platform to actually kind of like doing bits of code for those other teams and maintaining stuff for them. And that's very easy to happen with a platform. With a platform, you really want to have an X as a service, that teams can use the platform. You don't want to have the platform team owning bits of these other teams. And I found it quite surprising, really, that when we mapped this out and saw this, no one had really connected those dots before. So it's a useful exercise just to try this, to map out your teams and the interaction modes. And as a quick sense check, do you have too much collaboration going on? All right, so the third one is around team ownership. So if you want to get to the bottom couple of rows in John Cutler's diagram, then the team needs to own their own roadmap, be able to make their own decisions, not people outside the team telling them what they're going to work on, what their deadlines are. And here's an example of where that didn't work out. So there was the healthcare platform team, and there were the healthcare platform verticals. One of the verticals was basically, one of the verticals was quite old, 10 years. The other two were a bit newer. One of them was a new idea coming to market. And so this platform team, they had a lot of ideas like, how can we take this concept that this domain that we've owned for one vertical, and how can we make that more generic so it works for all three of these verticals? We don't want to have a bunch of if-else statements in our code, if this vertical do this, if that vertical do that, because then we'll just have lots of coupling. But we want to help these verticals to be able to focus on their problems and not this core platform issue that's outside of them. We also want the ability to spin up new verticals in the future quickly, and this platform could be a major enabler of that. So they need to figure out this difficult problem. How can we build something abstract for these different verticals? But the problem was, they weren't able to do what they thought was right, because they didn't have a budget. Basically, all of their budget came from those verticals. The vertical team would say, we need you to build this feature for us, and we'll pay you this amount of money to keep your team running to build it. And then another vertical would say, we need you to build this feature for us, and we'll pay you this amount of money for your team to build that. So this team was like, no autonomy to own their roadmap. All they could do is what the verticals were telling them to do, and it had to be exactly what the vertical needed. If the platform team wanted to build a feature, and it was more future-based or refactor something, and no vertical wanted it right now, there's no budget for that. So it was all very short-term driven. And I would say, if you're looking at team topologies and autonomous teams, and you've got this model, it's just not going to work. That team doesn't have the autonomy to do what's right for the company, to invest in quality into their platform. It's all very short-term, driven by those verticals who control them, like, do what we say, or you don't get the money. It's got no choice. And I also see this the other way, actually, where companies do have the right kind of leadership in place, but then when they move to these autonomous teams, the teams themselves aren't ready. I was in this one community of practice in 2020, I think it was. Told you that timelines are all blurry since the pandemic thing. So basically, the company had gone from project to product. They'd gone from like a fixed scope, time, and budget to teams who are responsible for certain areas. They were implementing team topologies. And I was in a community of practice, and one of the platform owners, he said, yeah, I'm struggling. After we've gone from project to product in this new world, I don't know what to work on. We're not getting enough feedback from the business stakeholders. I said to him, he said, I got an email recently. I just couldn't do anything with it. And I said, can you show us the email? So he showed us the email, and that VP, she said to him, I think these initiatives might be things to focus on, but I'm going to let you decide. I was like, that's great. She's saying, you can decide. Your team is empowered to build what you think is right. You tell her what you're going to do. If she disagrees, she'll let you know. Otherwise, keep going. Just keep doing stuff. And if she's not happy, she'll let you know. But he's been so used to working in this project mindset of having scope fixed, following this plan for months, he wasn't ready for it. So this concept of autonomous teams is difficult to get there from both perspectives. Leadership needs to put in place the funding model, giving teams empowerment, but the teams themselves need to be able to deal with that too. Very, very difficult issue. So if you go through the team topologies, independent service heuristics, there's a whole bunch of them. You can think about all these different aspects. And once you've done that, you'll get to a point where you're like, okay, we identified these domain boundaries. We've applied all of these team topologies checks. Yeah, and we think it's good. We think we've got to a good place now. We're happy with them. But it's not going to be a case of you go home on Friday and then you come back on Monday and do the big reorg. It takes time to make these changes. And it needs to be done step by step. I did work with one company. I went home on Wednesday. I had 2 days off. And on the Monday, they'd gone from project to product. But there was a reason for that. I wouldn't normally recommend that. So we have this concept in domain-driven design of core, supporting, and generic. And this helps us to look at those domains we identified during event storming and understand which parts of the business are the most important. If we're going to set up these autonomous teams and start reshaping our architecture, where's the most important place to start? We don't want to start this initiative and we pick a complex area of the system and the business are saying, well, you're going to spend 6 months on that, but we don't see any value there. So this tool can help you to focus on the domains that are most important and start identifying the right areas. With this kind of core domain chart, you can also analyze how things are changing over time. So usually, if something's moving up and to the right, it's getting more complex because you're solving a harder problem. That's a good kind of complexity. Whereas if something's more to the left and the arrow's going down, usually you're trying to indicate this thing has become overly complex. It's expensive to run and maintain. We want to reduce that complexity. So by mapping all these things out, you can start seeing your options about where you start applying team topologies, where you start refactoring your architecture. And you can have these conversations with your product and business stakeholders, and you can agree on exactly where to focus. The y-axis is how complex is it. As an engineer, that's your decision to say how hard it's going to be to exploit the opportunities in that domain. Whereas the x-axis is the business saying, this is how important it is to us to exploit opportunities in that domain. And so with this diagram, you can have an agreement on that and then decide what's the best cost benefit. So I've got an example here from a company in the experiences industry. This company was really interesting. They owned like a small part of the value chain. If I say what it is, it might give them away too much. It's basically like selling tickets, and then they decided we're going to do the whole thing. We're going to organize all the events, hotels, flights, accommodation, celebrities, all this kind of stuff. But they noticed they had this. They had not a 100-page. it was about a 20-page document with like 100 problems they've got. And we used the core domain chart to start assessing where they should focus. And we identified this one problem. It was basically, they'd started building these different systems up over time, and when they were making certain changes, certain kinds of changes to the product, they noticed, oh, we have to change these 4 systems together. There's a lot of coupling there. And what had happened is there was a domain that they didn't realize was a domain, and the bits of that domain lived in those different systems, and this was causing all of the coupling. So you had a bunch of teams all working in the same code bases, tripping over each other. And they also had this crazy manual process, involved 30 people and Excel spreadsheets, probably some other manual stuff in there as well. And that was another symptom of this. And the solution was really, if you can extract those pieces and put them together, you'll reduce that coupling, and you can solve that manual process, which involves getting data out of that system into that system into that system. So consolidating that domain will be a good, and this will also be a good candidate for setting up their first team. They currently had a project mindset as well. So using the core domain chart, we were able to have this conversation. The business were more focused on their core domains. They wanted to exploit those 2 domains in the right-hand corner with some new features and new capabilities. But with this chart, we were able to explain to them, actually, if we can consolidate that hidden domain and make that, we can get rid of that manual process, we can make those changes easier. Actually, when that system is simpler, it will be easier to make those changes in your core domain, because those core domains actually depend on that supporting domain. So this was how we were able to explain that actually investing in fixing the current system first would actually be better in the long term for adding those new capabilities they wanted in the core domains. So there's a couple of patterns, I think, which help to understand this concept. 2 seconds. So yeah, when you're going through this process of trying to identify where do we focus first, where do we set up team topologies, there are these different patterns that can give you clues about short-term versus long-term benefits. This one in the top right-hand corner is what I call a decisive core. It's very differentiating and very complex. And therefore, you know as a software engineer, any effort we apply here will be beneficial. Building quality in this part of the system will have an impact in the long term, because it's hard for competitors to copy. If you're talking about event storming and getting people together, these are the kind of complex part of your business where it makes sense to really do that. Whereas on the other hand, you've got this kind of indefensible core domain. I see a lot of domain-driven design people making this mistake, where something's important and they think it's a core domain, and it is, but because it's a bit less complex, it means your competitors will easily be able to copy this over time, and so in 1 year from now, it won't be your core domain anymore. So as an engineer, a bit less quality is needed here. It's a shorter term objective. I had one company recently, an American company for Texas, who do payments, and basically we did a session like this, and they said all of our domains go from core to supporting in 1 year. It's very hard in this industry to actually get a competitive advantage and keep it. Just nothing stays around that long. And that's the kind of thing you want to get from these sessions, to understand in a company like that, you can't really focus on one thing and just do that well. It's like we've got to have a constant stream of new things coming along, and that totally changes your mindsets about where you focus. I also think one of the problems that domain-driven design people make as well is, whenever they talk about core domains, they're talking about what makes money now. But actually, it's also about what makes money in the future. Something that's not making money now might make 90% of your revenue in just a few years from now. So it's also worth working with your stakeholders and your teams and looking at what's not here at the moment, or what are we looking at that could be a core domain in the future? What's a new thing? What's a disruptive thing we're working on? I worked on a project once. I was in that team. A lot of things happen when I take a day off. I took a couple of days off, and when I came back, like, some people from my team had been taken away. Like, what's going on, guys? We've got this major project that you said is like the big future, trying to get this thing running on the cloud, and you're currently on-prem. And it's like, oh, this other team over here have taken some people because they've got an urgent deadline. And I spoke to that team, and they're like, well, this is the product that makes the money, so we get to take your people when we need to. But no, that's a totally wrong mindset. You're taking away from your future self just to hit some short-term deadline. Solving that in 6 months could be much more beneficial than solving some immediate problem in the next 2 months. So again, with the core domain charts, we want to try and get these things out, talking about what's coming on here that's not on there now. Whenever you see things moving from the right to the left, you always need to worry, what's going to replace it? What's going to be the core domain in a few months from now? And then also, I find a lot of the supporting patterns can be interesting. In this example, you've got a supporting domain, which is depended on by lots of core domains. And this in itself is almost a core domain. A domain-driven design person might say, oh, that's a supporting domain, therefore it's not that important. But actually, if you look at this, keeping that supporting domain modular, clean, easy to change, it's going to make it easier for your core domains to change. So it is still very important. Just because it's supporting doesn't mean it's not that important. So yeah, with this tool, we can bring out a lot of nuance into these conversations and make sure we're applying the right mindset. And then there's this other one, the suspect supporting. I had a great example of this one. People thought this was their core domain. It was a company in Turkey a couple of years ago. And all the engineers said, oh, this order management system is our core domain. And we were like, why is it your core domain? Why is it over here? How does it differentiate your company? And they were like, well, it doesn't really differentiate us. It's just everyone's talking about it. It's the most important project right now. Like, well, let's dig into that a bit more. And basically, they were building a new order management system, but they still had their old order management system. And they had to synchronize the data, and the users had to use both systems because the new system didn't have all the features of the old system yet. So, okay, it's become a bit of a problem in the company, and people are talking about this a lot, but it's not really the core domain. People are talking about this the most, therefore it must be the core domain, but it wasn't. And we realized it was actually just way over here, just very complex. And it was important to get that complexity down because it was sucking a lot of people to work on that. All right, the final thing is what we call the modernization core domain charts. This is a great tool I use when thinking about where do we start specifically, especially when you're thinking about, we'd like to try team topologies and domain-driven design, where do we start? This can help you identify a good opportunity, balancing both the business aspects, the technical aspects, and the team aspects. So ideally, we want to pick something in the bottom right-hand corner, the low-hanging fruit. I would say this is a kind of project where if some company wants to try something new around how teams are set up and how they, maybe if they want to move to the cloud and try that, if you can build a new product that has immediate value to the business, something new, that's a good low-hanging fruit. In the top left-hand corner, we've got the opposite, something which is going to be very difficult to modernize and put autonomous teams around it, and there's not much value of doing so, so we can leave those to the end. And then we've got the difficult trade-off. In the bottom left-hand corner, you're picking something simpler, but there's less value. Let's say you're a company who's on a monolith to microservices journey. You might say, oh, there's a bit of the monolith we can extract out into a separate microservice. It's not that valuable to the business, but there is some value. If we take it out of the monolith, we can add new features a bit faster. But it allows us to experiment with the new tech and the ways of working. Whereas the top right-hand corner is something where if you can extract this from the monolith, you're going to get a huge payback. However, it's very difficult to get out of the monolith. It's like there's a God object, it's coupled to like 14 other things, it's coupled to all the database tables, it's going to take you 6 months to extract it. So yeah, when you're looking to apply these concepts and think about where we start, I think this kind of tool can be useful to balance the business versus the technical side of things. In my experience, there's always that. The engineers, we always want to pick something which allows us to validate the technical choices and the ways of working we're trying to establish. But then we have to explain to the business, actually, you're not going to get anything out of that in the short term, it's just for us. Whereas the other scale of thing is, the business might say, oh, we've got this big requirement, if you start there, then you'll be able to validate your new technology choices, and we'll get something out of it. But the problem is, because it's so complex, it might take much longer than you thought. I picked one company going on this monolith to microservices from on-prem to the cloud. They picked one of those. They were willing to take some risk in the top right-hand corner. They picked a project that had to be done in 6 months. 1 year later, they didn't even have one line of code in the cloud. They had so much compliance and security to deal with. They just didn't get one line of code to the cloud. So if you do take a risk up there, you've got the business people watching you and they're expecting something out of this. So yeah, it's always difficult choosing where to start. I didn't really talk much about how you measure the value on those different axes. You can check out a lot of information on this GitHub page. We've put some ideas. Also a great blog post here. Helps you to measure how complex different parts of your system are. So that's basically it. It's going to wrap up with a few things. I think firstly, I want to try and get to a situation where we can avoid big reorgs and big rewrites and just have organizations where it's more of a constant and gradual thing. And that's why I think it's important for teams themselves to understand domain-driven design and team topologies. And a team can identify, hey, we've got too much collaboration with other teams here. We need to have an X as a service relationship. If the teams identify that when it's happening, you're going to get assigned much earlier in the process and avoid that data integration platform where that team ends up owning a bunch of stuff they shouldn't, and it's going to be hard to undo that. As an example here, if you want to practice this, we've created a Miro board. There's an example event storm laid out, and you can slice up that event storm into domains. You can practice with core domain charts. Totally free to use. There's no advertising or anything. And there's some other tools here we didn't talk about. We've got message flow modeling, bounded context canvas, context mapping. These are other techniques from domain-driven design. You can read about them and see some examples and try it all out for free. There's this starter modeling process. We got a bit bored during the pandemic, and we were like, what can we do? Why don't we try and make it easier for people to learn and apply domain-driven design? And so we came up with this. This is not the first iteration, but it's where we've got to now. We don't recommend this as a best practice, but if you're like, how do I get started with DDD in my company? How do I bring these concepts in? It helps you to go through the process once or twice, see these different techniques, how they fit together, and then from there you can start going freestyle. And so, very final slides. 2 things I would recommend you to do after this talk. The first one is to read team topologies, bring these ideas into your company. I think that can only be a good thing. And the second one is, if you haven't done event storming before, run your first workshop. See if you uncover some interesting things. Try and bring a nice, diverse group together. The yoga room with the wood smell is completely optional, but definitely recommended if you like the smell of old wood. You can replace that with your own preferred smells if you like. And that's it. Thank you for coming.